All right, today we're going to be discussing some adaptations that humans have for hunting and gathering. So we've been talking about problems of survival, and one of the main things that we have to do is find enough to eat. And one thing that's happened over hominid evolution is that humans have started to consume more meat um, compared to other primates, including chimpanzees. So chimpanzees do eat meat. They used to be thought to be vegetarian, but we know they hunt and eat meat now. But they don't eat as much meat as humans do. And on average, around the world, about 20 to 40% of the calories that human beings consume come from meat. Um, and as you'll notice from the chapter, there's also many theories as to what it is that caused human beings to evolve the way that they did, the characteristics that they have, um, and in particular, what caused them to evolve differently from common chimpanzees and bonobos. And one very prominent hypothesis is called the hunting hypothesis. And this hypothesis states that the shift to a heavy reliance on hunting has caused us to have a lot of the distinctive abilities that we have as a species. Um, this includes, for example, our remarkable tool-making ability, our aggressiveness, our ability to cooperate, and also a sexual division of labor. As far as tool-making is concerned, humans are much better. Even the most primitive hominid tools outstrips what a common chimpanzee can do, for example. And cooperation is also very good among humans, at least within group. Language probably evolved to facilitate this, and many people think that a reliance on hunting led to that ability. But the thing that I want to focus on today is the sexual division of labor, right? Which is very common. It's almost a universal pattern among traditional societies where men hunt and women gather, right? In order to get enough resources, everything that we need, we seem to have to do both, and men and women seem to specialize in one or the other. So if the idea is that if this sexual division of labor persisted over long periods of time, we would expect men and women to evolve along slightly different paths, acquiring unique abilities that facilitate either hunting or gathering. Right? And many of these abilities may be cognitive instead of obvious physical differences, like differences in physical strength. And one area that's been investigated is whether there's differences in spatial abilities between males and females. And I want to preface this by saying that when most people talk about spatial skills, they talk about men being better than women. But one of the points that I want to make in the present lecture is that it really depends on which spatial abilities you're talking about. Men in general are better at some spatial tasks, and women in general are better at other equally important spatial tasks. So the research that I'm going to be drawing on mainly is some of the classic studies from Silverman and Eels. The textbook has some more recent study, but I want to give you the basics and the ideas that underlie them. So Silverman and Eels, they begin by outlining what spatial abilities have to be there in order for someone to be a really good hunter. And then they'll talk about what spatial abilities have to be there in order to make someone a really good gatherer. Right, so this is what they say about spatial abilities required for hunting. They say these attributes comprise the abilities to orient oneself in relation to objects or places, in view or conceptualized across distances, and to perform mental transformations necessary to maintain accurate orientations during movement. This would enable the pursuit of prey animals across unfamiliar territory, and also accurate placement of projectiles to kill or stun the quarry. Okay. So that was quite a mouthful, as you can imagine, so let me unpack this a little bit more carefully. The idea is that if you're going to hunt, one of the things that you have to do usually is track prey. And quite often this means that you have to pursue prey into unfamiliar territory, territory that you haven't been in before. And one of the things that can happen is that the prey moves in an unpredictable manner, in an unpredictable direction, and you have to keep track of where you are. Because what you don't want to do is get lost in unfamiliar territory. So as you're moving into the unfamiliar territory, you have to be aware of how to get back to where you came from. And this requires creating a spatial representation of the environment that you're going into, and be able to, in case you get turned around, you got to be able to manipulate it. You got to be able to turn it around inside your own head in order to figure out where you're going and where you've been. Right, so that's one part of it. They also say, in the last part of their definition of these spatial skills, is that when you're throwing a spear, especially if you're throwing it at a very large distance, you have to be really good at predicting internally where the prey is going to be in the future. Right, so if you're throwing a spear for a couple hundred yards, and you want it to intersect the prey, you have to predict where that prey is going to be at the point in time where the projectile lands in that position. Okay, so to summarize, it implies that hunters, to be good hunters, have to be good at creating and manipulating spatial mental representations. Right, so you have to be good at creating and manipulating mental maps of where you came from so that you can find a direct route home. Right? You don't want to get lost in unfamiliar territory, since that can mean death in a traditional evolutionary environment. Okay, and again, we have to be good at imagining where the animal is going to be a second later so that we can intersect it with our projectile. Now, what about gathering? What spatial skills are required in order to be a good gatherer? Basically, they summarize this by saying that you have to have really good memory. You have to have good memory of where things, or what things are out there, right? What objects are out there, and importantly, where to access them. Right? So this means that you have to be really good at remembering landmarks, and you have to be really good at remembering where things are relative to those landmarks. So food plants, here's what they have to say to summarize it, right? Food plants are immobile, but are embedded within complex arrays of vegetation. Successful foraging then would require locating food sources within such arrays and finding them in the ensuing growing seasons. These abilities entail the recognition and recall of spatial configurations of objects. That is, the capacity to rapidly learn and remember the contents of object arrays and the spatial relations of the other objects to one another. Foraging success would also be increased by peripheral perception and incidental memory for objects and their locations, inasmuch as this would allow one to assimilate such information non-purposefully while walking about or carrying out other tasks. Right, so they really stress the ability to extract information about object location, where things are located relative to one another, and learning this information very, very quickly, even if you don't necessarily need that information at that particular point in time. Why? Because you may need those objects at a later point in time. So what are some of the, what's some evidence that supports evidence for these spatial differences between the sexes? A classic study was done by Silverman and Eales using college men and women in Toronto, Canada, at York University. And they use certain tasks that would tap those mental abilities, the spatial abilities required for hunting. Right, so they used a mental rotation task and a spatial relation task to assess spatial skills relevant to hunting. Right, so what all of these have in common is that they require people to spatially to manipulate spatial mental representations. So here's a mental rotation task. You see a figure on the left, and you have to say which figure matches that figure on the left. So for the top, for example, the first option matches that, and for the bottom one, the second one matches. The second one from the left matches the one on the pattern on the bottom. Okay, so doing these things is not easy, right? You gotta create a mental representation of each option, and you gotta rotate it inside your head to see if it matches the sample. There's also a spatial relation task. So people have to say which figure definitely can be made with the sample on the left. For the top one, the option on the far right is one that you know for sure can be made with this sample. And for the one on the bottom, we know that the second one on the left can be folded into that shape. All right, so who does better on this task, on these tasks, right? So again, they gave males and females these tasks, and what they found is that males tend to score higher than females on these tasks. So for spatial relations, we see that the mean for the males is much higher than the mean for the females, and same with the mental rotations, where there's where the men were almost twice as good as the females. Now, what about tests that tap spatial abilities relevant for gathering? In this one, they used object memory and location tasks. And the way that these worked is that people had to stare at a display for 1 minute, right? So they were told to study this display. And this had a bunch of objects on it. And then they had to put it away, and then they were given another display. And now there's two versions of what they had to do. In the first, they had to cross out all the objects that were not present in the first display. So if a chair is shown in the display, in the second display, but not in the first, they'd have to cross it out. And in the second, some of the objects had moved around, others were in the same location, and they had to cross out which ones were in a different position. So this might be the one that they start off with, the one that they have to study. Right, so take a look at this carefully, scan it, see what objects are there, see where they're located. Okay. And this would be the object memory task, so they'd have to go through this and cross out things that were not present. And for the location task, again, they have to say which objects had changed location. So for example, the drill had changed location. So on this one, women tend to do better on both tasks. Right, so they have better memory for what's out there and where it's located. All right, so to summarize, men and women do have evolved spatial differences, right? Men are, in general, better at manipulating spatial mental representations, and women are generally better at remembering what objects are out there and where they're located. But one thing I want you to keep in mind is that the results are not categorical, right? So these are general tendencies, but they are overlapping distributions, which means that, for example, on some of the spatial rotation tasks, some women do better than some men. And in the memory tasks, some men do better than some women, All right, so these are generalities, and it's important not to stereotype people on these grounds, right? They're just general patterns. All right, but again, they support the hunting hypothesis and the idea that we have a long history of sexually dividing the labor between hunting and gathering between men and women.